Testing 1, 2, 3. Tom, you're on mute.
All right.
Hello, folks. Yeah, good evening. And this is Tom Genung with the Nebraska Easement Action Team. Part of the crew this evening is Shelli Meyer. She's with the Nebraska Easement Action Team. Emma Schmit is the director of assisting the other state directors and folks like us to in Illinois and South Dakota, North Dakota, and Iowa, and maybe one or two other places that I'm not remembering off the top. In the background, we want to thank Mark Hefflinger for doing the tech work and that sort of thing. He's not going to participate at least visibly this evening with this meeting, but just as a little bit of background, it's being brought to you by Bold, Nebraska and Bold Alliance. About 15 years ago, Jane Klebb founded Bold, Nebraska, and it turned out to be to help landowners organize against the proposed KXL Trans-Canada pipeline, which was a tar sands pipeline, by the way. Sometimes people still refer to it as an oil pipeline. It never was an oil pipeline. It was always tar sands, and I always like to kind of make that distinction. But anyway, we want to thank those folks for getting things ready this evening. And basically, when we thought about where do some people want to start, there's a lot of different places that a person can start, but kind of at the basic level, we thought that there are some people that maybe are a little bit intimidated with the idea of letters to the editor, and that maybe a little bit of information would help them find out that it's okay to voice their concerns in that way. And thankfully, Emma has put together some information that will assist with doing that, you know. So that was 15 years ago when that all started. And personally, I've been around most of that time because I'm a landowner. Shelli is a landowner, and with my part of things, I was affected by the proposed KXL pipeline and started getting acquainted with things that way. Shelli's come along in the last couple of years to assist landowners to be organized as well against the carbon pipelines. And so this evening's work and ideas will be directed toward that idea of carbon pipelines and that sort of thing. And yet at the same time, we have 15 years of experience behind all of it. So the pipelines that came along this last couple of years, there's Navigator, which is kind of withdrawn from the visibility of it all. Summit Carbon Solutions, which is still being real active. And if you're on for some of the preliminary visiting that we were doing, getting ready for the meeting this evening, you heard some remarks that were concerns and direct toward that Summit Carbon Solutions. The other one here in Nebraska that is of interest to a number of people is called Tallgrass. And so those three carbon pipelines have gotten our attention, and we've assisted landowners with various kinds of things for the last while. But like I said, you know, oftentimes people are a little bit intimidated with the idea of where to start. And that pretty well covers that type of thing. I would stop right there and ask Shelli if she has any opening remarks before we turn it over to Emma.
Yeah, my opening remarks are thank you for joining us tonight. We will be recording this so we can use this for future information. The important part of this is that we found that letters to the editors in pinpointing your legislatures or your county board or something like that really gets their attention. And when you have it in your local newspaper, or I had one over the weekend from the Tri-State Neighbor, you don't realize how much of an impact that is to understand that how you feel Then you got to tell your story. You got to tell why you don't want eminent domain to be used on your ground. You have century farms like I do, that are important to you. And so these stories are very important. And if you don't think that anybody's reading them, they are. Whether it's online or it's with still paper today, which is getting less and less, but still, that information is very important, and people do read those. And our certain group is our certain group, but to get outside the group into these newspapers and online is very beneficial to make sure that our point gets across to, because this doesn't just concern us involved right now. As you can see, Summit has increased their footprint with Poet and Valero today. And so you may not be affected today, but you may be affected tomorrow. And then the water permits that they're trying to accumulate as well affects every living being. So you need to be aware of what they're doing, either on top of the ground, below the ground, and way below on groundwater. So you need to make sure that we pass the word to everyone in the community, because it affects everyone when it comes down to, these ruptures that could happen, and also the water that they're taking from us and everything else. So that's where we stand today, and we need to make our voices heard, and we need to make sure that our county supervisors, zoning, hear us. They heard us in Stanton County. Thank you very much for those in Stanton County. And they denied that permit for Summit. And we need to do the same thing coming up in Antelope County on March 12th. And we need to learn how to communicate our passion for our ground and our love for what we do in our ground for the next generation. Go ahead, Emma.
Well, I don't know if I should go ahead after that rousing speech. Wow. That was fabulous. Thank you, both Shelli and Tom. I do, before we dive in too deep, want to just have folks, if they can, introduce themselves in the chat, share your name, where you're from, what pipeline you're impacted by, or I guess if you're not impacted by a pipeline, why you care about this issue. And with that, while you guys are introducing yourselves, we can go ahead and start talking about letters to the editor. I should warn you all that this is my first time using 2 computer screens. So if I mess this up, well, it's my fault, but we're going to blame Shelli. This is all your fault, just so I can feel better about myself. So thanks.
In the meantime, if everybody would just mute themselves so prevent any background noise.
Yes, yeah. Keep yourself on mute if you're not talking, please. And if you do have any questions throughout, feel free to pop them in the chat and we will answer them at a starting point when we get to it. So to kick us off, I am sure, well, I know that we have some old hands at writing letters to the editor here, Bonnie, for example, but I am also aware that there are probably some folks that might not be quite so experienced. So we're going to kind of start at the beginning and make sure that there's a little something for everybody in this training. So to begin with, let's just talk about what exactly a letter to the editor is. So an LTE, to put it as simply as possible, sorry, my cat is trying to pet herself with the screen of my laptop. That is why we're moving around here. But anyways, so a letter to the editor at its like most basic definition is just a short statement that you submit to your local newspaper that voices your opinion on some matter, right? It can be an opinion that is for or against. And now she's knocking over vases. My cat is really causing a ruckus here. And I guess I should amend that statement that it's not just submissions to your newspaper. It can be submissions to your church newsletter, to an online blog, to really anything. But we primarily see this going to newspapers as the most common format. So that's kind of what we're going to hone in on, but just know that all of this is pretty much applicable to a variety of different publications. So with that, we should know that letters to the editor are really one of the most simple and effective ways to bring attention to an issue. They are printed in the opinion section of a paper, which, if you didn't know, is one of the most widely read sections of the newspaper. If you are wondering what the #1 most read section of the newspaper is, this is a fun fact that you can share with all of your friends. It is the obituary section. Unfortunately, we can't get into the obituary section at this point, not yet anyways. I'm sure that someday when we kill these carbon capture pipelines for good, I will have a scathing eulogy to offer. But until then, we're going to have to settle with getting our letters to the editor into the opinion section. As you can see on the PowerPoint, we do have a variety of headlines that have been used for LTEs about carbon pipelines. So as long as we are looking at these headlines, I do just want to be sure to mention that you should absolutely feel free to include your own headline when you submit your letter to the editor. It's not guaranteed that the newspaper will actually end up using it, but they often do. And just in general, I would say that our headlines tend to be a bit punchier and just a little bit more engaging than what the newspaper will write. They tend to take a more neutral stance. So if you are submitting an LTE and there's a spot to include a headline, go right on ahead and offer something. So to just quickly recap all of that, a letter to the editor is a short opinion piece that you submit to a publication that's sharing your opinion on a subject. And also the obituary is the most read section of the newspaper. Don't forget that. And now that we have those little tidbits of knowledge tucked away in our brain, we can go ahead and talk about why LTEs actually matter. Why are we even here tonight? So there are a whole gaggle of reasons of why to write an LTE, but I have kindly went ahead and condensed that down to 4 main points. So first up, letters to the editor are just a mighty fine way to persuade people to agree with your opinion. In my family, we like to say that I'm not always right, but I'm never wrong. And I reckon when it comes to carbon capture pipelines, that motto probably applies to you as well. So just by writing a simple LTE, you can help shape the public dialogue and sway public perceptions around carbon pipelines and carbon sequestration. So then next up, LTEs can also inform the public. I'm sure each one of you knows a ton about carbon pipelines because you've been directly impacted and engaged in this issue for ages. But that is not the case for the majority of the population. And we need to constantly be growing the number of people that are opposed to these projects if we want to win, which I know we will, but that means that we need to be reaching new people who don't necessarily know what's going on constantly. And one of the easiest ways of doing so is through letters to the editor. So your letter to the editor, it can share information, it can combat industry lies, and it can encourage new people to get involved and join us in this fight, which is what we really need at the end of the day. If we go on to the third point, a letter to the editor can also help spur community dialogue. It can be that catalyst to really get discussions going in your community. I will share that this actually happened not too long ago in my own hometown. A resident wrote a letter to the editor criticizing a decision to cut down a tree in order to build a grocery store. And I can say that I have never, ever seen a letter to the editor garner so much discussion in my life. I should probably mention that I do live in a small town, so we don't always have a whole lot of things to talk about, but I can say that I never once expected a tree to dominate the local gossip for weeks. I guess we must have just been really desperate for conversation topics because everywhere you went, it was being discussed, from Casey's to community meetings. There was at least, I would say, 10 people that wrote their own LTEs in response to this discussion about a tree being cut down. I have never been so fascinated or entertained by a tree since I watched the second Lord of the Rings movie, honestly. Unfortunately, the author of the original LTE, while he did do an excellent job of prompting a community discussion, he didn't do quite so well at persuading people to agree with his opinion. Because I would say that most of the LTEs that were written in response to the original were pretty quick to note that the tree was already dead when it was cut down. So that did kind of take the fire out from underneath his argument, but it was still a fascinating time in the history of Rockwell City. And nevertheless, it got people talking, which is exactly what an effective letter to the editor can do and what we're hoping to achieve through this training tonight. And so if we move on to the last and final point, letters to the editor are influential and a free, key point there, a free way to get elected officials, decision makers, and the media paying attention to an issue. All of these groups of people are monitoring the opinion pages of newspapers to see what their constituents or their readers are concerned about or interested in. Our members of Congress actually have a staff whose responsibility it is to read letters to the editor and op-eds that are published in their district newspapers, just in order to kind of keep an eye on the top issues that their constituents care about. So an LTE can catch the eye of those people in power and really push them into taking action on an issue. And the same goes for the newspapers themselves. If they get a ton of LTE submissions about carbon capture pipelines, then they know it's a topic that people want to hear more about. So they're more likely to cover it closely. So that is kind of why LTEs are so important, because not only is it your voice being heard, but it's an opportunity to make sure that others are talking about it and learning about it. And at the end of the day, really an opportunity to make a real difference. So hopefully you are all excited to go ahead and write your letters to the editor. But before you start writing, let's talk about how you actually make an impact with an LTE. Here we go. So we have what is essentially a simple formula for writing an effective letter to the editor. And again, I've broken it down for you to just 4 easy steps. And with these 4 easy steps, you can ultimately compose an LTE that will help stop risky carbon capture, transportation, and storage projects, I hope. But before I go over each of these steps really quick, I do want to just discuss the length of an LTE, because I think that's often the most challenging part, at least for me anyways, but I do like to run my mouth, so that could be why. But these bad boys they are short, right? They are usually between 200, 250 to 300 words. So your goal here is really to make a strong impression quickly. You're focusing on the quality of the words over the quantity, because frankly, you just don't have a whole lot of quantity to work with. Your paper will typically have some guidelines on the word count, so be sure to actually check what that limit is before you start writing, because it can vary just in a smidgen from paper to paper. And I also want to just note that if you are struggling, if you really can't fit what you have to say into a limited amount of words, you can always go ahead and try submitting it as an op-ed instead. So op-eds and letters to the editor are fairly similar at like the root of things. They're both focused on sharing an opinion. But the main differences, I would say, are that op-eds are typically a little bit longer. They tend to be, I think, around like 500 words or so. They're also harder to get published. A lot of papers kind of expect you to have some sort of credentials, something to really back up why you should deserve such a large space in their paper. And finally, not every paper will actually accept op-eds. Some papers just don't print them. They focus purely on LTEs. So it is my professional opinion that while op-eds are an option and certainly something you can explore, in general, it's probably easier and just more recommended to keep it concise, cut words if you have to, and submit it as a letter to the editor instead. And with that in mind, we can discuss what the format for an effective letter to the editor is. So to start, your LTE should begin with a statement that captures the reader's interest and frankly, the editor's interest. If the newspaper editor isn't interested in what you have to say, you have a less likely chance of getting it printed. So make sure that your opening line is really something that makes the reader kind of pause and pay attention to what you have to say. You can kind of compare it to a headline of a news article, right? You want something short and snappy and engaging, something that pulls people in. You might reference a startling statistic, or you can try and tie it to some sort of recent event. You can pose a provocative question. There's all sorts of ways that you can grab people's attention. And like I just mentioned, tying it to a recent event is always highly recommended, just because this connection winds up making your letter both timely and just increasing the chances of it being published. And so we will actually here in just a little bit kind of look at some real life examples of effective hooks, or what we call these, catchy sentences, these effective hooks in just a few minutes. But before we do that, let's talk about step 2. So after you have written your opening hook, you've caught the attention of the reader, you want to take just a sentence or two to summarize what is actually happening with this issue. I know we briefly discussed it, but that we need to be bringing new people into this fight, and not everyone is actually paying attention or even aware of the proposed project. So your LTE won't exactly be helpful if people don't understand the context. So make sure that when you're writing your LTEs, spare just a few words, a sentence to actually explain the situation, whether it's something like, for example, Summit Carbon Solutions is proposing to build a yada, yada, yada mile pipeline throughout the Midwest, that sort of thing. Just a really brief, very like 40,000 foot overview of the situation, just to make sure people are clued into what we're talking about. From there, once you've kind of done your brief little explainer, share why you actually oppose these projects. I know that there are unlimited number of reasons that people are against these projects, but since, like we discussed, we are working with a pretty limited space, just a few words, it's usually easier to focus on only kind of one or two specific concerns. So once you know what you're going to talk about, you've narrowed it down, you want to figure out how to actually communicate what you want to talk about, right? So one successful method is to illustrate the issue that you are concerned about through telling a personal story. People tend to relate to and remember the information that is shared through personal stories the most. Like, it's one of the most effective ways to communicate. This could look like, for example, let's say you want to write a letter to the editor about Summit land agents harassing you. All right, that is a great topic. And you can just kind of share what happened. You can tell your experience. And that is a great way to kind of tug at people's heartstrings and get them interested and involved. And we love to see it. But if that's not necessarily your jam, if you prefer to keep things, less personal, more professional, you can also address your concerns just by sharing or expounding on, a fact or two. That is perfectly acceptable and just as great a way of bringing people in and capturing their interest and attention. So those are kind of the two easiest ways to communicate your ideas, but there are, any number of ways. I'm sure we all know how to write. I hope we all know how to write, considering we are on this training. And with that, you should feel comfortable to just kind of share how you want to share it. But I will say that framing it through a personal story or through citing just, a handful of facts, one or two usually, tends to be the most effective way to get things actually published. And for our final step, to wrap it all up, you want to always try and end your letter to the editor with some sort of call to action. Hopefully people read your letter and they want to do something about the issues that you raised as a result. So we want to give them a task. We want to give them a quick and easy way to get involved at once, because if we give them too much time to, sit back and think on things or forget about things, then it's not going to happen. We're not bringing them into this fight. So we want to right away give them something to do. And this could be really anything, right? We can call on readers to write to their legislators or to show up to a meeting that's happening. If we wanted to, we could also turn that around a little bit and actually call out decision makers and demand that they take action, whether it's by denying a permit or supporting a piece of legislation, and in turn calling on the readers to also call on these elected officials to do something. Really, it's just a matter of utilizing whatever action makes sense at the moment. And it really can be anything. One of the easiest kind of fallback things to end a letter to the editor with that I found is just calling on people to learn more about an issue, whether that means sharing a link or recommending a book. I mean, just something that offers folks the opportunity to continue on this journey with us. There's any number of ways you can do that. But with all that, I will say this is kind of a tried and true format. Like I said, I'm assuming you all know how to write. And if that's the case, you don't have to follow this format. If you have something that already works for you, don't feel like you have to switch things up. But I have seen this work time and time again. So it is definitely an excellent kind of 4-step solution to writing an LTE. And I know I moved through all that fairly fast. So before we move on, do folks have any questions? I'm going to scroll through the chat really quick.
Yeah, there are some comments in the chat, Emma.
You want to ask them?
Basically, they were talking about the word content, the number of words to make sure you know what your newspaper requires so that you know what the limitations are. And also, let me run through a few more here.
Oh, I see one comment from Jamie about making sure that you have several people kind of look it over and preview what that is. Yes, it is very easy to miss a typo or whatever. So
spelling,
I will say,
spelling,
I'm sure,
and everything. Yep.
I'm sure myself, Shelli, Tom, we are always happy to proofread an LTE before you submit it. If you don't have anybody else, that is one of my favorite parts of this job. So always let us know.
But that's really it right now. Include your phone number and email address as well. So most newspapers require that. So
yes,
just be prepared to give that information.
Yep. And kind of with that, I will say that I don't see this happen quite as much anymore, but there are papers that when you submit a letter to the editor and your phone number, they will call you to make sure that it was actually you that submitted it. And so just, be aware that in the few days after you've submitted an LTE, you do probably want to answer all of those unknown phone numbers, because it very well could be the newspaper calling to make sure that it was you that actually submitted something and not some random person. I don't know if that's ever actually happened, but they use it as a mechanism anyways.
Good question that Lisa just mentioned. Is it required to be a resident of the publication area?
No, it is typically better. That is a really good question. You're more likely to have your letter printed if you live within the distribution area. But I mean, I've submitted letters to, as far away as Mason City, Sioux City. Those are 2 hours away from me, and they've been printed. I think it kind of just depends on if you're able to tie your issue to that local area. And yeah, I see we have a hand raised though. Jamie, tell us more.
Yeah, when I sent mine out, I sent it to newspapers all over the state of South Dakota, because it was 2 landowners to get them to go to the PUC and write their comments up. And I started off with over 1,000 words, and I found out they wouldn't publish it until I went back and I had to refine it. And that's a big job, to cut it down to what they would accept to get it published. So
yeah,
just some thoughts.
Yeah, it definitely is. It's always try and check those word count guidelines before writing anything if you can. But I will say, if for some reason, you are struggling to cut down on words and you just don't want to submit it as an op-ed, there are, any number of online blogs. I'm sure if you run it by us, we could probably put it on the Pipeline Fighters website. I mean, there are other places that we can post longer content, but we do like to see it run in local newspapers and attract, folks from your community to get involved.
Also, I found out on Facebook, Summit Carbon Solutions, if you comment negatively, they will block that comment. If you put your comment in and then reshare it publicly, a lot of times other people will get to see it.
That is excellent advice. We love to hear it. Amazing. All right. With that, if there aren't any other questions.
There was one more that I think you're going to cover. And is it permissible to submit your LTE to more than one source at a time? I think you're going to cover that in this PowerPoint.
Yeah, hold on. Otherwise, you're going to screw up my flow. No, we will definitely be talking about that in just a minute. But before we do that, let's just, quickly go over some messaging. If you are like me, you can run your mouth about these carbon pipeline scams or just about anything else all day long and have no shortage of material. But I know that not everybody is a blabbermouth. Congratulations. I'm a little jealous. So if you are searching for something to talk about, we do have just a few ideas here. These are also kind of messaging ideas that can be slipped into really any letter to the editor. And we actually just saw Summit just the other week. They were whining about our talking points at the National Ethanol Conference. So we know based on that these talking points are effective, right? If they're complaining about it, then we got to keep using them. And that's not to say that this is all you should ever think about covering, but these are just some ideas to get you thinking. So talking about the safety concerns and the risks that we're expected to take on with these pipelines, and in conjunction going over the lack of oversight and how there really isn't any strict regulation of these pipelines or the injection process. One of the big things that has been really helpful when it comes to, especially like the hearings, is pushing back on their claim of economic benefits. Like, we know that everyday people aren't going to see any sort of benefit from these projects. It's all about making money for a few wealthy investors. And so being able to just continuously push back on that narrative is really helpful and gives us, in some instances, exhibits and whatnot to introduce into the regulatory hearings, which we love to have. Other kind of common topics that we can bring up is just the fact that giving away hundreds of billions of our tax dollars is an absolute misuse of our tax dollars. We should not be investing in, making profits for private corporations when we could be putting our public tax dollars to a real use and actually benefiting the public. And I know Shelli mentioned this a little bit, but water has definitely been one of the key talking points that we've heard over and over again recently. And we need to keep hearing it over and over again, especially as we continue to just learn more and more about exactly how much water these facilities are going to require and just what a drain they're going to be on our communities. Of course, there's always the eminent domain angle. I know we're all pretty passionate about property rights, so that's a pretty obvious one to include. And then finally, being able to point to recent victories when, we saw that Summit was denied in South Dakota, for example. Down in Iowa, we wanted to talk about that because we can point that, hey, they are acting like this is a done deal. But if we just look to our neighbors, to the north, no, it's really not. And so being able to kind of spread what's happening in the other states and also just giving people something to hope for is always something I'd recommend including in your LTEs if you can. With that out of the way, and with my cat once again trying to knock over my vase, oops, I think I went too far. Let's talk about submitting your letter to the editor. So we know that we've got our LTE written. It's beautiful. You followed the format for the 4 steps and you've included your messaging, right? Wonderful, great job. Now it's time to actually submit your LTE, and this is going to look a variety of different ways, but first, before you do anything, make sure, once again, we'll say it, check your paper's opinion section for the guidelines. That way you don't wind up writing a novel when they are only accepting a paragraph or 2. So most of these guidelines will be posted in their opinion section, but if you can't find it there, or if you just don't get the physical paper delivered to your house, I would say that 99, if not 100% of papers also have an online submission form that also includes the guidelines. So look online, look in the paper, wherever, just the word count is there somewhere, as well as the, where to submit it, how to submit it. So look for it, check it out. And then kind of going back to the question we had briefly heard, make sure that you're submitting to one paper at a time. I have definitely seen a lot of pieces get printed where they have submitted it to, a dozen newspapers all in one go. But in general, like the advice that I've always been given from communication professionals is that it's best to submit to one paper at a time. If, let's say, that newspaper ends up not printing your LTE, you know, follow up with them, ask if they're going to, if they, you know, have any intentions of ever using it. And if they say they're not going to, then you can go ahead and submit it somewhere else. That's just kind of the proper etiquette. But again, I will say it seems to be becoming more common to kind of, you know, mass submit it, and it'll still get picked up. It just tends to be that papers can get a little salty, I guess, if they, you know, think that they have kind of exclusive access to somebody's LTE, and then suddenly they see it printed in a dozen other papers. I do see some hands going up. So Jane, you want to share?
Okay, I think you kind of answered it, but to me, when we do this, we usually submit to the biggest papers in the state of Nebraska, which is the Omaha, Lincoln area, and then go out to the more local, smaller rural towns. But usually most people in Nebraska have a subscription to the Lincoln and Omaha newspapers. So we usually do those two at the same time. And then if they don't run it for some reason, then we'll hit the other ones. Just
Absolutely.
a comment.
Yeah, it's always, I mean,
Yeah.
you want as many eyes on your writing as possible. So submitting it to the
Yep.
biggest papers, if they'll print it, absolutely.
Yep,
course,
and
it
we
is
do,
typically-
and that's the point too, where Northeast Nebraska, it's like Norfolk Daily News, Sioux City Journal, you know, those are the bigger papers, but then there's the local papers as well. So yes.
And yeah, I would just add that it is typically a little bit of a higher bar to get published in the bigger papers, just because they are receiving more letters and they have more to choose from. But so that's kind of why it's easier if you just are submitting it to your local paper. But everywhere you can get something published is a good place to submit it. Bonnie, I know you probably have excellent advice, so tell us, share your wisdom.
I don't know about that, but yeah, for one thing, the Des Moines Register, one, is hard to get published in, and two, they're kind of snobby. They do not accept multiple submissions, and they want you to wait. I think it's 3 or 4 days before you submit anywhere else if you submit to them. But on the other hand, they don't let you know if they're going to, at least they have not let me know that something's going to be published. So I'm just sitting there not knowing if I can resubmit it or not. But I do multiple submissions of mine, but then I guess I know a lot of the editors, and so when my columns, I usually send them out to 20 or 25 local papers. But then I have also done the Argus Leader, the Sioux City Journal. I've done those too. You just have to treat them differently, and you have to be sure to follow. Mine are usually op-eds because I get kind of wordy, I guess. But I have cut. Mine are usually they like an op-ed. They say 800 words is your limit, and I try to stay around 750. But if it's a topic I'm very passionate about, I will make an effort to shorten it up and submit it to, excuse me, the smaller papers also. And it's hard to take 800 words down to 300 words and still have anything that is of substance. But in some ways, it's even better when it's shorter, because you got rid of a lot of, I guess, stuff that isn't really necessary. So
Yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't really thought of it that way, but yeah, excellent advice. Wonderful. Any other little tidbits? Otherwise, we can move on to some other tips and tricks and go over those. All right, hearing none.
There's one Emma that said one of the papers I submit to won't print something if you've already posted it on a blog or website.
Yep, and that
So-
just goes back to them just kind of having their own little rules about what they you know, feel a little bit of ownership over, I guess is how I would put it. They want to have the exclusive rather than something that's already been out there. And that reminds me too, one other thing is that there are some papers that will only accept or will only print, you know, LTE from you every certain amount of time frame. So I don't know if there's like an exact like kind of typical number that you need to go between seeing another LTE printed after they've just published one, but I think it's usually a couple months where they will wait before they'll publish anything else from you. I think that's definitely more common with the larger papers than the more, you know, rural, smaller papers who aren't getting quite as many submissions, but it's one thing to be aware of. You know, don't feel bad if you submit something to, you know, the Omaha paper, the Des Moines paper, and they aren't printing it because they just printed something. And it's really probably just because of their own inside rules and not because you're an awful writer or anything like that. So with that, let's talk a little bit about some of the tips and tricks that we found to help elevate and just make a successful letter to the editor. So one of the first things is that while you are more than welcome and encouraged to include facts and citations, things like that, try not to overuse numbers, because once you get too many numbers in there, it can just, you know, people's minds blank out and they're not going to remember any of them because it's just overwhelming. So feel free to use a handful of facts, a handful of statistics, but don't get carried away with it. Another really helpful thing is to include your credentials, whether, you know, you are speaking as a landowner or you're speaking as a farmer or a doctor or whatever, anything that can kind of give you some sort of position of influence to make it sound like you know what you're talking about is always helpful. And that especially goes when you're submitting an op-ed rather than a letter to the editor. Almost always they want to see, you know, some sort of credentials to back up what you're saying in your op-ed. But don't feel, you know, embarrassed if you brag a little bit and talk up, you know, hey, I got my degree from Yale or something like that. Just, you know, don't give yourself some credit and include your credentials where and when it makes sense. Like we just kind of got done talking about, you are more likely to get published in your local paper just because you are a resident. You can absolutely be published in places, you know, far away, and you can absolutely be published in, you know, some of the larger papers. But if you're going for the quick and easy option, target your local newspaper. More often than not, they will publish whatever you send them. A big one that is really easy to forget about is to avoid jargon, especially with this fight. You know, we use all sorts of words that we kind of forget our jargon. I mean, PHMSA, CCS, even CO2. I mean, there's all sorts of just different little phrases that we insert into our language. And while we might understand what we're talking about, a lot of times the folks that we're trying to reach with our message, you know, just the general public, they're not going to have any idea what PHMSA means. They're not.
So the acronyms is what you're saying. Yeah.
Acronyms, anything really that you feel like if you didn't know what this meant, you know, 2-3 years ago, you pick a different word, pick a different way of saying things. It's really easy to let it slip in. So trying to be aware of it, always helpful. Keeping it original. You know, if you're saying just the same thing that you've said in the last 14 LTEs that you've submitted, you might get people a little burnt out. So always try and speak with your own voice. You don't feel like you need to be copying somebody else's like writing style or LTE. Like be yourself and just be unique and share your perspective. Like that's what letters to the editors are about. It's about sharing your perspective. So just do that. It's pretty simple. And then the last tip is to follow up. If you haven't seen your LTE published and you're kind of just waiting around, do not hesitate to reach out to the editor and ask like, hey, I submitted this on whatever date, just wondering if you're actually going to print it or anything like that. And more often than not, they will respond. They'll let you know if they're going to print it or if, you know, you've been rejected. And if that's the case, hey, we can move on to the next paper and submit it elsewhere, because I can guarantee no matter what, there is going to be a paper somewhere that will select your writing and publicize it, because frankly, a lot of times they're pretty desperate for letters to the editor. I say that because why else would my newspaper have run 10 letters to the editor about a tree? So clearly they are wanting to hear from their readers and local residents. So feel free to make sure that if you don't get printed somewhere, keep going, keep trying, because there's always options available. And with that, I have some examples to go over. Do we have any other questions really quick? I guess I should pause.
No, there's some comments in here about the water usage that was pinpointed, and people start talking about that because that affects the water situation affects more than the landowner easement. And so that's the key trigger to some people that, oh, it affects you and not me kind of thing. Oh, yes, it does, because you may not be able to have drinking water if this goes through. So that's the key point there. And
Yeah,
then they need to remember that. And so that's a great point to always indicate the water permits that these people want. And then
thinking of your audience and how, what
Yeah.
speaks to the audience you're
Yep.
addressing is always helpful. And water's definitely a way to do that.
Yes. So yeah, there aren't any other questions that I see right now, Emma. So go
All right.
ahead.
Perfect. So I included a couple of examples of just kind of effective little snippets that we've seen in LTEs that have actually been published. So this one here, it starts off with, I'm a simple farmer. I'm not a protester or an activist. I'm not even much of a writer. I guess sometimes we are forced to be things we are not. Excellent intro. I mean, it's personal and it's engaging, and it makes you wonder, okay, if you're not a writer, what are you writing about? What has, influenced you to take up a pen when that's not really your thing? And so that is a wonderful example of the hook, right? Your opening sentence. And he went on to, I kind of think, just personalize things really well. And also I'll just read it so you can kind of understand, because this is just an excellent LTE. So after his hook, he goes on to say, I have to admit that I do feel guilty. I had heard about this carbon dioxide pipeline quite a while ago. I dismissed it as a ridiculous idea and thought that common sense would prevail. It didn't hit home, well, until it hit home. Now I realize what we were up against and the battle others have been fighting. I can't help but think it could have been different if I had stood up sooner. Again, it just kind of powerful, wonderful way of putting it. And it also gives you that little bit of background so people understand what you're talking about. You now see that it's about carbon dioxide pipelines, and clearly there's something going on there, and it makes you kind of want to investigate more and continue reading. This last section that I highlighted really kind of goes over just the various concerns that people have. And that's one of the things that we want to be sure to include in our LTEs. This is why he's writing, right? So he says, some will tell us that this is a complicated and difficult decision. It's not. It's quite simple. Either you believe in property rights or you believe in money. You can oppose this thing for a variety of reasons. Maybe you're concerned about safety. I believe those concerns are justified. Maybe you're concerned about the cost. And that is just a money grab for private companies. I mean, he lists all these reasons, and in doing so, basically outlines why these are a bad deal. And so it's just a really creative, wonderful way of being able to share concerns in kind of a unique way. Jamie, I see your hands raised. Okay. Jamie, do you have anything to add to that?
I had when I submitted my editor letters, I submitted an email, and I got an email back from a newspaper. She said, I cannot publish this unless you pay $90 to have it published because it's too controversial. I said, okay, don't publish it then. Well, the following newspaper, she published the whole 1,000+ word one because I had sent that one and the shortened version. And she never.
You just call me next time they want money and I'll pay for it. That's BS. Just call me.
Yeah.
I'll give you a credit card number.
You'll run into that with some of these newspapers.
It's interesting too. A lot of papers have started kind of printing a little statement in all of their opinion sections saying that we don't necessarily endorse or support the opinions that are put forth in these letters. So I've seen that come about more and more. So it's just interesting. I guess they're a little afraid of people being sue happy or something. I don't know. I've never seen someone try and demand payment for a letter to the editor, though. That is a unique one. Wow. So if we go to this next example, maybe, there we go. Again, we kind of start off with a pretty interesting opening line. Growing up, I enjoyed listening to Paul Harvey's radio program. I'm not going to lie, I'm too young to know who Paul Harvey was, so I did have to Google that. But after I did, I thought it was a great hook. So he says, I enjoyed listening to Paul Harvey's radio program, the rest of the story. To see the whole picture, this is my take on the rest of the story on carbon capture. And then he goes on to just list a whole just slew of facts and statistics. And this is an interesting way, because normally we say, you know, only include 1 or 2 facts. Don't, you know, make it overwhelming. But the way he writes it is just, he phrases everything with, did you know that the process of CO2 capture from ethanol plants, yada, yada. Did you know? Everything is just a did you know statement. And it's a powerful way of being able to put all of your thoughts and everything out there in one go without it being, you know, clunky or awkward or weird. So
This is very powerful, Emma, because I've noticed several that have done this intro to each paragraph. Did you know? I didn't know that I was going to have to be, I didn't know this. I didn't know this. I didn't know this. Or did you know? So it's a very, it captures you, because you keep reading and reading and reading each paragraph. And it's like, no, I didn't know that. Or, you know, so it's very capturing of the reader to start every sentence with that. Did you know? Or I was not aware of this, or I didn't know I had to do this, or I didn't know all of that. So it's very capturing to the reader.
Right. And especially effective in a situation like what we're in, because there's a whole lot we don't know about these pipelines. And so there's a whole bundle of options to write about here. And then I also noted his kind of closing remarks, because he did make that call to action. So he notes that if you can watch this YouTube video to see what is really happening, and also talk to your legislators and tell them to say no to carbon pipelines. So he actually makes 2 asks. One, you know, something to learn more, and then to follow up with that by contacting your elected officials, which is exactly what we want to see, a perfect execution. I would commend Paul for this piece. And then if we go, I think I have one more example. I know we're getting kind of close to the hour. So this last example, another really excellent piece that, Shelli, this is the one you just sent to me earlier today. So they start off by sharing the fact that no eminent domain for private gain is a message that over 80% of South Dakota residents and landowners support. So right there, you've stated a fact, you've kind of gathered, or you've obtained the attention of people, because that's interesting. You want to find out, why do 80% of South Dakotans not support eminent domain for private gain? Makes you want to read on. He goes on to talk about how Summit Carbon Solutions is seeking to bury a pipeline on private property. Again, that goes back to that second point in the typical format that we suggest using. Kind of just giving a brief, really quick overview of what the issue that you're writing about is. And that is a succinct way of putting it. They want to build a pipeline on our land. And then the final thing I wanted to highlight is, I really enjoyed the way that they put this. And this is kind of going back to correcting misinformation and the lies of the industry, and just doing some simple myth busting. So Charlie says that Summit has no real concern for the environment. In fact, they have no real endeavor to help ethanol, other than using ethanol plants as a means to pirate into private land holdings to bond to build their project. Their only end goal is to obtain lucrative tax credits. And that right there is, I mean, the rest of the story, as Paul would put it, right? It is just an excellent way to succinctly and easily put out there that this is, they might be saying this, but the truth is actually this. And we love to see that in letters to the editor. Always a good move. And with that, I want to see if there's any questions, comments, thoughts, deep, dark secrets, whatever you got. I know this was a lot to take in and pretty rushed, but hopefully you took something away from it. And I will add that we do have I will share this in the chat actually. If you weren't taking notes, don't worry. We have a bit of a summary document. I think Mark might have shared this already, but if not, you can always review this document to get an overview of what we've talked about tonight. Ooh, a fact sheet. We will send out kind of a follow-up email with the recording and everything else, and we can include a fact sheet because I love that idea. Wonderful. All right, I saw a couple hands raised. Bonnie, tell us.
Yeah, I just have a couple of notes about how to actually write the letter. This is just how I do it, but I write it in Word. Don't try to write your letter in an email. I write it in Word and I use the editor, and there's even a new feature on there where you can have the AI will read your letter to you. And I pick up a lot of mistakes there, like dropped words and so forth. So
You're talking about Microsoft Word, right? Microsoft
Word. Microsoft Word. So write your letter in Word, and if you're not familiar with this, I think it's the lower left-hand corner, it'll have the word count. And this is very important. Keep an eye on that so you know when you're reaching your limit. Anyway, you get your letter done. Then you do a copy paste and put that letter directly into the email. Don't add it as an attachment because the editor wants it right there in front of them.
Good point.
And when I submit a letter at the top, I put my name, address, date, email address, phone number, and word count. I put all of that at the top of my letters. And sometimes I will add an introduction like dear editor or dear Nick, if I happen to know the editor, and I will explain why I'm sending this. And I think that's helpful to them.
Absolutely. Those are all really good points. What else you got?
That's about it. And don't ever just write your letter and send it. Let it set a few hours and go back and read it.
Yes.
9 times out of 10, you'll want to change something or tone it down or something like that. Don't ever send a letter when you're angry.
Yeah, I may have made that mistake once and it did not get published. Thank goodness I realize now because it should not have been published.
Yeah, well, this last letter that I wrote when I named names and called out Whitford and Brown, you wouldn't want to see my original of that before it went to press. I was just pretty upset with them. So
yeah, that's all really good advice. On the topic of AI, I am going to admit I've been playing around with ChatGPT a lot, and if you are a techie person, I could definitely see how it could be useful in writing a letter to the editor. It can provide you kind of, some ideas. It can help you write your headline or just give you different prompts to inspire you. I would never just let it write an LTE and copy and paste it. That would be probably disastrous. But having, AI kind of help you in the process, I could see that definitely being something that becomes more and more common as we adjust to a time where we talk with robots and it's not weird, I guess. Yeah, I'm not gonna lie, I did use ChatGPT to try and help me brainstorm a title for this webinar. It did help me, honestly, but had it, I would have not felt any guilt using it. Sherry, I see your hand up.
Well, if you can hear me over that dumb dog, I'm kind of leery about AI just because of the amount of water they are using. So yeah, maybe it's my personal thing, but I'm not going to use them.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. I mean, definitely there is no reason to. You are perfectly capable of writing your own excellent LTE. I am positive of it. But if there's, if you are a techie person or just curious, I mean, you can always give it a shot, try it out. But good point about the water usage. That's definitely something to consider. All right. Oh, Bonnie.
Oh, just one more thing. I want to tell everybody that Summit reads our letters.
Yeah.
So I've had them call me wanting to address my concerns.
They're probably on this program that we just submitted. They've probably
Yeah.
participated, and we just don't know them by name.
Right.
I'm pretty
Right.
sure they have a list and we're all on it.
Oh yeah, we know they do. Good point though. We're now going to see just a whole slew of really excellent letter to the editor submissions from Summit that are very pro pipeline after they've seen this training, I'm sure, right? Because they're here with us tonight. No. With all of that, thank you all for participating. And we do have, just before we go, one quick series of next steps. I don't know, Shelli, if you want to go over this a little bit.
Sure. We have an Antelope County CUP meeting on March 12th. We just were informed today that Summit wants to have a safety open house on March 11th. The Monday before, God knows what they're going to talk about, because they won't submit their plume model. They won't do anything, with
Shelli,
any other state.
I can send you pictures of what they did in Iowa for the safety meeting.
Well, I'm sure it's a joke, but anyway, so we have that coming up on March 12th. So anybody and everybody, we need to push forward like we did with Stanton and get everybody just flooding the board members with that. We have Dakota County CUP meeting on April 16th. That's the zoning again. They denied it last summer. I was there. I cried walking out of the building because they said they wanted 100% easement. Now I'm not sure what they're doing, so I'm concerned about that. I will be there. And we just have lots of things coming up. So it's important that you tell your papers and your commissioners, supervisors, your concerns. It's the most beneficial thing you can do. I know I was approached in church a couple of weeks ago. He said, I'm just not comfortable on, being confrontational. I said, you don't have to be confrontational. All you have to do is just say, I don't want this. That's all you have to say, and so you have to just be willing to call your county officials that you thought were supporting you instead of a company that has foreign investors. It's $1 billion company. It's a private company that wants to make billions and billions of dollars and off of your ground. That's what you need to take away from this, is that you need to write everybody in your dog about everything and just say, I treasure my ground and this is why. And so please contact your zoning, your commissioner supervisor, tell them how you feel, because that's what worked in Stanton. I mean, they were even texting during the meeting. Okay, so they knew there was no one that were for it as far as landowners. The only people that were for it was Brent Neese from Summit and his cronies from the ethanol plant. And of course, they're going to make money and you're not. It's not like you're going to make $15 corn when they put this pipeline in. That's not going to happen. Okay, so just remember that. This is all about a private company. And that's what you need to remember. And that's what makes me so upset. So please tell your commissioner supervisors how you feel and tell them that you're opposed to this. Write a letter, do whatever you can, because it's so important that you do your voice. I know it's against what you've done in the past. You don't want to have controversy. You don't want to have people angry with you, but this is your land. It's your ground. And my ground is now a century old. And so my grandparents made it through the 30s. My parents made it through the 80s. This is my new 80s. And I'm going to do whatever I can to make sure that that isn't lost to this private company who wants to rip it in half to put in a pipeline to make their billions of tax credits. So,
Well
sorry.
said. Wow, no, that
I
was-
went on a rant there. Sorry about that.
That was excellent. And yeah, just, I mean, kind of like you were getting at, if you don't say it, if you don't speak out, they're just going to assume that you approve of it. If this is your chance to make sure that they know where you stand, because otherwise these decision makers are going to assume that you don't care, and they're going to grant this company or all of these companies their permits because they're not seeing the backlash. So you need to make sure that you say something, whether it's a letter to the editor, an email, a text, something. Very least you can do to protect the land that's been in your family for who knows how long. I did see,
And the water you drink, don't forget about that.
absolutely. I did see a couple questions come in. One is, are they revealing that this is setting up to make jet fuel? I think that is definitely going to be the case in some of these at some of these facilities. There's definitely a lot of money to be made in sustainable aviation fuel at this point in time. So I would not be surprised. We also saw that Tallgrass, I think United and Great Plains have entered into a contract to create jet fuel. So at least they will be certainly working on SAF, if not others.
Well, we want to make sure that Bruce Rastetter has all his buddies with their private planes, be able to fly along with Taylor Swift. I love her to death, but come on. So.
Yep. And then I recently heard that they will be trucking carbon from Western Nebraska to Wyoming. Is this something you've heard at these meetings? We do know that they're going to be using a sequestration site in Wyoming for the Tallgrass pipeline project. So that is the project where they're converting a natural gas pipeline to a carbon dioxide pipeline and moving it as a gas. And they have already, submitted their request to be able to sequester in Wyoming. And unfortunately, Wyoming is one of the states that has primacy over the siting of injection wells. So it's largely just up to the state of Wyoming on whether or not that will happen. And they are very pro this carbon capture and sequestration.
Maybe out of respect for people's time, we should bring this to a close.
Yep.
We're a little bit past 1 hour, and don't know what everybody's plans were, but this has been great. So
Thank you.
we'll wrap it up.
Yeah,
One-
absolutely. I would just say that we have
Thank you,
our
Emma.
Thank you,
emails
Emma.
on the screen. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Otherwise, thank you all. We'll stay on for a few more minutes, but if you want to get out of here, go ahead and scram. Thank you
Thanks,
again for
Emma.
joining us.
Thank you, Emma.
One thing I wanted to point out to you guys is I watched a video out of North Dakota, their governor, and there was an oil engineer. She made the statement that part of this will be sequestered, the rest of it will be used for the Bakken oil field to frack oil.
Yep.
And Wyoming has put $44 million aside to do a study. So it could go across South Dakota to Wyoming.
Oh yeah, it's going to be
It's-
everywhere.
We've got a mess out in our legislature right now. It's a terrible mess. Anyway,
Yes, you do.
Join the
Agreed.
club. Join the club.
Yep.
Agreed.
Yeah. That's
thank you.
why it's so
Thank you.
important to stop these. If we don't stop them now, we're going to have them everywhere. So just another reason to write a letter to the editor. Tom, I'm sorry.
Well, I was just
And
going to thank Jamie for his observations and
Yeah.
remarks and stuff like
Yeah,
that. And also, once again, thank Bold Nebraska, Bold Alliance, Jane Klebb, and Shelli for sure, Mark for sure. Our emails and phone numbers are on there. Feel free to get a hold of us. And special thanks to Emma for a great program. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Emma. Thanks, Bonnie. Thanks for being a wonderful writer. Thanks, Bonnie.
Our resident LTE expert. Thank you all. I'm sure we will all talk soon.
Bye. Thank you.